Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to our audience on the West Coast. And thank you, everyone, for bearing with us. Our firm, 800 Lawyers Wide, just experienced a firm-wide network outage, but we're happy to report that we're back online. So sorry that we're starting a few minutes late. But thank you for joining our webinar, What Employers Should and Should Not Say to Employees to Manage the Challenges of the Coronavirus. Our webinar is hosted by my law firm, Venable, as well as Ketchum, a public relations firm with offices all over the country, including here in Manhattan. My name is Nick Reiter. I'm a partner here at Venable and as well as co-chair of the law firm's National Labor and Employment Practice Group. And my co-presenter with me here today is Andrew Moselle. Andrew is Senior Vice President of Global Issues and Crisis Management at Ketchum. And before we just kick off here, Andrew and I want to extend our best wishes to everyone in this uncertain time that we find ourselves in. We hope everybody listening today and that their families are safe and healthy. I'm also, just before we get into substance today, going to address a few housekeeping items. Andrew and I are going to present for about maybe 40 to 45 minutes, and we're going to try to take a few questions at the end of the program, time permitting. There's quite a few of you out there listening today, over 600. In fact, so we do not expect, of course, to be able to answer everybody's question, but we're going to see some of the common questions that come in and try to answer those at the end. But Andrew and I are also going to follow up after the program with anybody who submits a question online. And additionally, our contact information is on the final slide of the slide deck, so feel free to reach out to either of us with questions after the webinar concludes. And as you're going to soon hear, this webinar is really intended to provide a blend of both legal and practical advice. There are obviously legal do's and don'ts about what employers should be saying to their employees regarding coronavirus-related issues. But there's also best practices for managing an organization's workforce during a time of concern. And as the lawyer on today's panel, I'm going to focus primarily on the legal issues that are in play, while Andrew, as the PR professional, is going to focus on the practical side of things. But after practicing for 12 years now, I know that attorneys occasionally forget to wear their business person hat as well as their lawyer hat. So we're going to keep that in mind as we go through the legal and practical considerations during the webinar. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew Moselle, who will start off our program with a discussion about best practices for keeping employees informed about their employer's policies related to COVID-19.
Thank you so much, Nick. As you just said, we're going to start with a pretty broad overview to talk about some best practices that we recommend for really all companies and that we've been putting in place with many of the clients that we work with as well. So the most important overarching principle, and maybe this goes without saying, although I think it bears repeating, is to be able to make sure that you're positioning yourself, or that's HR, the legal profession, whoever is communicating to employees, that you are both a helpful and a credible source of information about what is going on with the virus. That's proactively sharing the protocols, whether that's travel, whether that's working from home policies. We're going to get into a lot of that later on this discussion. Whether it's policy changes that about things that people are used to that might be a little bit different during the current climate, and of course tips to help people stay safe, whether that's sanitary conditions or working policies. And this may vary a lot from workplace to workplace. If you're in an open workplace and people are working cheek to jowl, might be a little bit different than if you're in a law firm and everyone has their own offices. But making sure that people are aware, and even though things might seem like they're obvious or they might have got it from other sources of information, we find that it's extremely helpful to position the company as a person that is giving valuable facts and information. A common question that we get is how much should employers be communicating to employees? And I think this is a situation where it's hard to over-communicate. You probably don't need to be sending new emails to clients when there's no new information, although we're finding that there's almost never a day where there's nothing new. So I think anytime that there is valuable information or important changes that need to be communicated to employees, we find that companies are doing it and are best served by doing it. And some of you, in fact, many of you might have already started communicating with employees about policies and procedures, but we think it's important that companies are thinking about not only the initial communication and sort of level setting, but how are you creating the expectation that the employer will be the source for ongoing updates and where to receive important information and details about what's going on in the company and potentially what's going on in the world. So whether that is email, which is clearly a tool that many, if not most companies use, if you have more of a manufacturing setting, whether that's arming managers with talking points or putting things up in break rooms so they understand the policies, and whether if your company has an intranet, creating a site, a dedicated space to put the latest updates on what's going on. And with all of those communications, it's important to be as clear and consistent with those policies as possible. You want to set clear expectations about what employees should be expected to do, which somewhat sounds obvious on its face, but we're finding more and more that there's a lot of nuance to these communications that employers need to think about. For example, if there's a travel policy that's changed in terms of restricted or non-restricted travel, who's the ultimate arbiter about who's making that judgment call? And employees need to know who is the point person for those decisions and others, and ultimately making it clear about what is exactly up to the employee's discretion, encouraging employees to work from home, for example, and what is a hard and fast rule in terms of exhibiting symptoms and staying home for a certain set of quarantine period, for example. So making sure that everything is detailed and clear as possible. Sharing plans about what the company is thinking about doing is important, but you never want to speculate about what might happen in the world. If this does happen, then we will do this. Is perfectly fine. If schools close, we encourage families, or we permit families to work from home. But you don't want to be speculating about what necessarily might happen in the world. Employee communications are not the place to pontificate about your potential view on the situation. And lastly, whether if you're working in legal, your company, or HR, we really find that this is an important opportunity for a company to seem human to its employees. In communications, we encourage them not necessarily to just read bland corporate communications about any information like a change in vacation day policies, but that you're trying the best possible to express empathy both for employees and their families and what people are going through. Some of the ways you can do this is by doing a video communication as opposed to just sending a text through email, and talking about employees and what toll this is happening on both them and their families, and really connecting with them on that human level of the experience that we're all going through, and helping to alleviate those anxiety, the rumors, and a lot of the misinformation that is out there by doing so.
Thanks, Andrew. So that was kind of our effort to start with the general, and now we're going to hone in more on some specific examples and frequent questions we're getting from our clients. And probably, arguably, the most frequent question that I received at the start of coronavirus concerns was, may an employer require an employee to disclose his or her illness? And the short answer to that is yes, but there's an important qualification. It's yes, so long as the employer has visibly observed the employee displaying coronavirus-related symptoms. And the reason there's that important qualification is that the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits an employer from asking employees about disability-related medical information or requiring an employee to submit to a medical examination. Now, that prohibition on those inquiries or a medical exam, that prohibition gets relaxed when an employer receives information to suggest that an employee poses a direct threat to safety. And in the case of coronavirus, let's just think about it for a moment. If an employer observes an employee with symptoms that line up with what the CDC is publishing about coronavirus symptoms, well, then that employer very likely has enough evidence to determine that the employee might pose a direct threat to safety. And if that's the case, then it's okay to require that an employee disclose the symptoms that he or she might be experiencing. Now, where some employers get into trouble, though, is when they cross the line into inquiring about disability-related medical information before they have that objective evidence of a threat to safety in the workplace. That's not allowed. So to give some examples, an employer can still ask general questions such as to an employee, hey, are you feeling okay? There's a big difference between asking a general inquiry like that, are you feeling okay, compared to, for example, hey, are you having trouble breathing, or do you think you might have coronavirus if you go even further? And so what I've been recommending to employers is that they start with the general. They start with questions such as, are you feeling all right? And then if that general inquiry, which is permissible, if that leads to information suggesting the employee is symptomatic, then the employer can evaluate what next steps to take. And one of those next steps, and another frequent question we get is our next slide, may an employer require an employee to stay home? And the answer is yes, but it is critical and legally required that employers are enforcing that policy consistently. And what do I really mean by that? If an employer is sending home some employees, but not others, if they're basing their decisions on information they're receiving about whether an employee is symptomatic and poses a threat to other employees, well, then the consistency rule, the uniform application of that rule really comes into play. On the other hand, if the employer has decided just to send everybody home, close its offices, everybody's teleworking who can telework, and we're going to talk about that later in this webinar, then that consistency rule isn't as important because obviously everybody is subject to the same go home requirement. But let's take an example because I think that'll really illustrate it. Let's say we have an employee named Sam. Sam is sick. Sam thinks he has a cold. His nose is stuffy. He has a headache. He just doesn't feel great. But he doesn't have a fever. He's not short of breath. He doesn't have a bad cough or any of the other symptoms on the CDC website. So a lot of employers are asking, what should we do with instances like this employee named Sam? Well, it's okay in this situation, in this hypothetical, for Sam's employer to say to Sam, okay, Sam, go home, stay home until you feel better, and when you do feel better, come back to work so long as, and this is the important part, so long as you haven't experienced any of the symptoms associated with coronavirus and you don't have any reason to believe that you've had potential contact with someone who has coronavirus. It's alternatively also okay if an employer wants to go a little further in that situation with Sam to say, Sam, go home, stay home for 14 days, and even if you feel better before that 14-day period is up, just stay home because we want to be extra safe. It's probably okay to as an employer to go either of those routes. But what's not okay is to apply one policy to someone like Sam and then to apply another policy to someone that's in a very similar situation as Sam. And that's why employers should be thinking now about the different situations that might arise in the coming weeks as cases of coronavirus are expected to increase, and what they're going to decide for employees that fall into each one of these suspected or potential situations. And those situations, just to give you some other examples, it might include people like Sam who aren't feeling well but aren't displaying any symptoms. They might include an employee who's feeling perfectly healthy, but that employee recently traveled to one of the CDC Level 3 travel advisory countries, or maybe that employee recently went on a cruise ship. Another example is employees who are feeling perfectly fine, but they might have reason to believe that they came into contact with someone who is infected with coronavirus. Or, of course, probably the most serious situation, somebody who isn't feeling fine, and they report one or more of the symptoms listed on the CDC site. Savvy employers are going to think about these potential situations and others now, and they're going to make internal decisions about how they're going to handle these situations, and then if employees come forward, they're going to identify which of those situations the employee falls into and make the same decision for all similarly situated employees. And as to the final bullet on this slide, before I turn it back over to Andrew, just a quick word about physician's notes, because I'm getting a lot of questions from employers about that too. Physician's notes may be required when the employer has objective information suggesting that the employee poses a direct threat to safety. And that information obviously can come in a variety of ways. The employer might visibly observe the employee's symptoms of coronavirus in the workplace. The employer might receive a report that the employee was observed with those symptoms. Or maybe, and this seems to be happening a lot because people are being smart and diligent, maybe the employee self-reports. They come forward, they send an email to a manager, or they call the manager and they say, I woke up with a fever today and I have a cough. What should I do? And in all those cases, however the information comes in, requiring a doctor's note is okay. But in other cases, requiring a doctor's note might be prohibited under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And remember, if an employer is going to request a doctor's note, I'm not saying it's absolutely mandatory in all these situations, but if an employer is going to go that route, then the request for the doctor's note should be a request for whether the employee is fit to return to work in the workplace. It doesn't need to go further and say, tell us yes or no whether you test positive for coronavirus. It should be limited to a medical opinion that the employee is fit to return to work. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Andrew to discuss some best practices about when an employer thinks there might be a coronavirus case in their workplace.
Thank you, Nick. And so for the following information, we're assuming that the proper legal channels have been followed, and that there's an employee who either suspects that they might have the virus and has reported it through appropriate channels, or has had a conversation with someone, their employer, about it, or has actually been a confirmed case through a test. And this is another situation where we feel that it is important to be as transparent and communicate as openly as possible with employees, because throughout this entire situation, but I think in no more important situation than if there's an actual confirmed case, the role of communications in terms of the broader employee workforce is to be able to reduce the level of panic, rumors, anxiety within the workforce, and as we talked about before, clearly communicate what the appropriate measures are that they're expected to take and also that the company's taking on their behalf. So therefore, if there is a case, and there is somewhat of a judgment case whether or not it's every employee. You can't send an email for every employee that might stay home because they're potentially having sniffles and they're just exercising caution. However, if there is a case where someone has been tested, or whether or not, or felt that was the level of concern that they had, whether or not that test has come back positive, for example, it's likely a good idea to start communicating with employees about exactly what has happened and what actions the companies are taking as a result. So not only if that includes starting to send employees home or entire offices from home, obviously that needs to be communicated, and then what preventative measures are being taken in order to prevent and mitigate the spread of the virus after those actions have been taken. So whether that's cleaning, whether that's other measures to protect the employees in the workplace, making sure the employees know what is happening so they feel more comfortable returning to the workplace and carrying out their jobs on a daily basis. Certainly, if you're communicating with health officials, if the situation has reached that level, you want to communicate to employees. And if you're having trouble finding out or determining what exactly information you should be communicating or what policies to follow, as many of you I'm sure already have, the CDC is updating their policies and their guidance on a daily basis. And I think communicating to employees that is the standard that the company is following is tremendously helpful, so they understand that there is a common measure that this company is taking in relation to the industry and the business community at large. In terms of what those communications contain, we think that it's best to include as much information as is legally allowed and is prudent given the situation. So provide the context and source and the scope of the information, again, to cut down on the unofficial channels of information as employees talk amongst themselves. So noting the location of employees so that people don't think that the spread of the virus is larger than it is. That's, of course, if there's a situation in the West Coast office, it's probably still a good idea to let the East Coast office know what is happening, just so that they're aware that the company is taking action and that the policies that it has probably already stated are being followed consistently. But if there's a contamination, let's say on the fourth floor of an office building, letting people know on the second floor that what is happening, even if the decision hasn't been made to have a complete office closure, because obviously once employees start understanding that people on the entire floor have left, you want to make sure you're clearly communicating exactly why that decision was made and what the company is doing to, again, protect their own health and safety. And actual information, anything that employees, again, need to do as the policies of the companies change, as the actions of the companies change, so that everyone involved, again, even if they're not directly impacted, have an understanding of what the policies are and how they're being applied across the organization. And finally, to reiterate, I said this in my first slide, but I think this becomes particularly important if and when there is a case identified, is making sure that you're not just being a fount of information and details and policy, but that you're really communicating the appropriate level of empathy and understanding about how this is impacting the workforce, their families, how the company feels about what they're doing, and understanding the situation that they're going through, and also reiterating that their actions not only affect themselves and their own families, but there's a common sense of accountability between both all the employees in that organization, but also the public and their customers and other stakeholders who they may touch on a daily basis, and that the company has the best interests of both them and others in mind. So with that as the principles, we thought it would be helpful to share a scrubbed example of an actual communication that we worked on with a client when there was a suspected case of CV-19 in one of their offices. And I won't read the whole thing that's up on the screen here, but just a couple of important things to call out. Again, the first sentence here kind of sets the tone about how the company will be the central point of information to provide important updates. It clearly defines exactly what the problem is, who has been identified, what the level of the contamination has been, and then it goes on to enumerate in a few number of ways, again, restating the policies about what is expected of employees, even if these policies might have been expressed already in a previous communication, reminding employees so that they understand what exactly is expected of them. And lastly, closing the communication, again, with restating the why, the purpose of these communications, what the company is doing, and that it is appreciating the company as the employees' understanding and compliance with all the rules and policy changes as everyone goes through this difficult challenge.
Thanks, Andrew. Our next frequently asked question that we've been hearing from employers is about travel. What should employers tell employees about travel activities? And rather than just kind of read the bullets here, I want to really highlight an important distinction first that all employers should be keeping in mind when it comes to employee travel. Where an employee travels, especially if it's voluntary travel unrelated to work, because the employer is probably already aware about work-related travel. If an employee decides, hey, I'm going to a wedding somewhere abroad or maybe to Seattle, that information is totally different than medical information. It's in a totally different arena because medical information is protected by a number of different laws, such as the Americans with Disabilities Act, HIPAA, and various analogous state laws. Travel information isn't really subject to that same legal protection. And what that really means for employers is that an employer has a lot more latitude to make employment decisions based upon an employee's travel activities. For example, it's okay to require that employees disclose their recent travel activities, especially if the requirement is narrowly tailored to, the disclosure requirement, that is, narrowly tailored to travel on a cruise ship or a level 3 health advisory country. And unlike medical information, there's really nothing that prohibits an employer from inquiring or requiring disclosure about where an employee has been traveling lately. And employers should consider mandatory teleworking periods for employees who have visited a level 3 health advisory country or who recently went on a cruise ship. We're advising our clients that. And frankly, as the situation domestically is unfolding, it's probably a good idea to add high infection rate regions that the United States government identifies, such as Seattle, Washington. And if you see on the bottom bullet here on the current slide, employers should remember that workers' compensation and OSHA rules, that's the Occupational Safety Health Act, those rules will likely apply when it's work-related travel. And so what that means is if an employee is infected, if they come down with a coronavirus case during a work trip, well, then he or she may have a workers' comp claim or an OSHA claim. So if that happens, an employer should be notifying their workers' comp carrier, their other insurance carrier, and they should obviously be consulting with legal counsel. Now, on a related note, and I think this is arguably one of the most important parts of this webinar, a lot of smart employers, they're asking, well, what else can we do to minimize risk? And one of the best things employers can do is to discourage their sick employees from toughing it out. And what do I mean by that? Well, if this wasn't just a webinar, if we were doing a live program in a conference room, and if I asked everyone who's listening to raise their hands if they've ever dragged themselves into work on a day when they were feeling really sick, I imagine nearly everybody would raise their hand. I know I sure would. I mean, I haven't taken a lot of sick days, and I know a lot of people are the same, because taking a sick day, it stresses me out. I have my clients, I have deadlines, I have angry judges who want briefs filed, and if I take a sick day, I fall behind and my business suffers. Or maybe think of me not as a lawyer, I'm an hourly employee, and I don't have any paid sick time remaining, and if I call out sick, then I'm going to lose out on my regular paycheck that I need to help make ends meet. That type of thinking is exactly the type of thinking and behavior that employers should be discouraging. And forward-thinking employers are going to be thinking of creative ways to increase the likelihood, to encourage their employees not to tough it out, to play it safe instead of coming to work when they might potentially pose a risk to their coworkers. And how can an employer do that? Well, one obvious way, again, Andrew's going to talk about it at the end here, is teleworking. But not every employee can telework, of course. You know, a lot of the audience I know has a substantial part of their workforce where, because of those employees' job duties, they can't perform their jobs remotely. So as an additional encouragement of safe behavior, I've recommended to some of my clients that they temporarily enhance their leave policies for staff. And that doesn't necessarily mean a free handout that's going to, hurt an employer's operating budget. One cost-effective way to do that is to permit employees to run a negative paid time off balance temporarily if they don't have any remaining paid vacation or paid sick time at the moment. And how that works is the employee who's going to be quarantined or sick, they go out, they continue to be paid as if they were using paid vacation time that they don't have, and then when they come back to work, they gradually accrue new vacation time under the employer's normal vacation accrual schedule, and they can't take any new vacation time in the future until their vacation balance is replenished and goes back into the positive territory. And really the only way that that becomes an economic burden for the employers in the long run is in the unlikely event that the employee, the employment relationship ends prematurely. The employee is fired or resigns prior to replenishing that employee's vacation bank. And so why are these creative ideas for encouraging safe behavior amongst staff, why is that really important? Well, first and absolutely foremost, it's because of the safety threat. We all have just a moral obligation to do what we can to contain coronavirus. But additionally, coming up with these temporary enhanced leave policies or other ideas to encourage safe behavior, it's also probably going to help lower an employer's litigation risk profile. And what I mean by that, and I hope I'm wrong about this, but it won't surprise me if several months from now or a year from now, after we see which workplaces had infections inside the workplace and which didn't, it won't surprise me if we see an uptick in the number of OSHA claims and negligence claims by employees against employers where there were infections in the workplace. And the actions that employers are taking now, before that litigation wave hits, those actions will be very relevant to the types of defenses that an employer might have against that type of a lawsuit. And so by permitting teleworking and offering enhanced leave packages like a negative PTO balance and some of the other recommendations on this slide we're on right now, those employers might be able to limit their risk of a lawsuit arising from a case of coronavirus in their workplace. And on that note, I will turn it back over to Andrew for our final slide before we handle some questions from the audience.
The last slide pertains to employees that will be working remotely. Obviously, that does not extend to every single employee in certain organizations, but we wanted to take a minute just to touch on the factors at play here, considering in the coronavirus. So there could probably be an entire webinar, if not multiple, on the legal and culture implications of working from home. But the key points that we want to call out here is that If you haven't already begun a discussion with your IT departments about the infrastructure that your company has to support remote employees, it's certainly a good time to start. My company, Catch, moved to a flexibility model where people are encouraged to work from home or whatever works for them a few years ago. So we're well positioned to be able to have large numbers of employees working from home, but many companies are somewhere within that transition process, or they're still in more of a traditional office environment. So even if the company is moving to a remote work environment because of the virus, and it's not used to that situation, sending out a note with some helpful tips about how to use the technology, Q&As about what's permitted working from home and what's not permitted, and also just understanding about what the load can be on the company's IT infrastructure to support things like video conferencing, et cetera, because VPN. Because what might work with a handful of employees might not work when there's an entire workforce or large segments of it using the same infrastructure. And if that infrastructure does fail, you want to make sure that you have contingency plans, both for communications but also for larger sense of business continuity. How are employees getting information about updates on the coronavirus or just general business disruption and resumption? So whether that's creating text chains or phone trees or other ways that employees can get the information that they need if there is a significant disruption. And one way that we've worked with other companies for situations where that might happen, for example, in a data breach, is by understanding who in the workforce would be considered an essential employee or a non-essential employee, and then dividing the infrastructure, the use of the infrastructure, or having other policies to ensure that essential employees have access and are able to do their jobs, while permitting non-essential employees, again, to stop working or to suspend whatever their work doing in order to free up bandwidth for others to be able to perform. And lastly, again, there could probably be an entire webinar on this, but just in case your company is forced to move to a working remotely situation for an extended period of time, a few tips are to use video conferencing, assuming that your infrastructure can support it, really whenever possible. This is something I've gotten used to over the last couple of months in my company, not just for major conference calls or meetings with clients or customers, but really whenever there's any discussion with someone to try to, if it's all possible, use a video conferencing tool in order to be able to see them. It does really help. Especially if you're going to be remote from that person or your team for weeks and months at a time. And to encourage informal communication. It's really easy to get into a pattern of only communicating when there's a conference call or a major call with a client or customer, but making sure that employees are calling and texting each other and trying to mimic the best as possible they can, sort of the quote-unquote water cooler conversations, in order to maintain that continuity of culture, and encouraging that as we see companies that are suspending different kinds of workforce activities, whether that's celebrations or get-togethers or business travel to conferences, trying to find ways, partnering with HR and others to maintain some continuity in company culture, whether that's having virtual gatherings that aren't necessarily directly business related, or finding fun ways to mimic some of the things that you might do in the office, whether that's prize giveaways, giving employees. We do some with our remote teams. We will send a gift card to employees for $10 at Starbucks and encourage them to go get Starbucks, and then do a virtual coffee date between teams. So just thinking about as we still understand how the situation will evolve and get into new territory of companies that aren't used to working separately for long spans of time, thinking about how you are maintaining the continuity both of the business operations but also of the culture as best as possible.
Thanks, Andrew. I think we have a little bit of time now to take some questions we're getting from the audience, and we're going to do our best to try to distill these because we see the big list of questions coming in, and there's a lot of natural overlap. And one common question is about an employee who might display some symptoms of just feeling ill. Maybe they're coughing a little bit, or maybe they're sneezing, and there's an inquiry made about the employee's how that employee's feeling, and the employee says, well, it's just allergies. You know, I have allergies and I'm perfectly healthy. Can that employer still send the employee home? And what happens if that employee refuses to go home? Does that employee still need to be paid? And the answer is yeah. You can, as the employer, I mean, remember, this is at-will employment. The employer has the control over the employment relationship and the terms and conditions of employment. So if the employer has decided, well, this person poses a threat and we want to play it safe and we're going to send him or her home, you can send them home. And if they don't have any leave time and they're an hourly employee, if they're salaried, it's different. They probably still need to be paid, or they can be teleworking maybe. But if they're an hourly employee and they don't have any available leave time, then yes, they're not going to be paid for that time. But this highlights some of the comments earlier during the webinar, is that it's really important that, A, you're encouraging that safe behavior in the first place, maybe through temporarily enhanced leave packages, because you don't want employees like this employee who might pose a threat to want to stay in the workplace if, in fact, they pose a threat to their colleagues. But additionally, you have to, from a legal standpoint, apply that same decision every time then. So anytime somebody sneezes consistently, you're probably going to have to send them home. Otherwise, there might be a discrimination claim on your hands. And that's why, as an employer, you have to decide, well, what kind of decisions are we going to make to keep our workplace safe? And on another related note, if that employee comes forward then and says, well, here's a doctor's note showing that I have allergies, you're probably in a situation where you have to permit that person to return to work. Another common question we're seeing is about, frankly, a lot of questions coming in now about the disclosure of information related to if there's a confirmed or suspected case and the identity of the individual. And you absolutely cannot identify an individual's identity when you're disclosing to employees that there was a coronavirus case in the workplace. It's likely a HIPAA violation, amongst other violations. The exception to that is about managers or supervisors who have to know in order to perform their managerial or supervisory duties. And there's also some questions coming in about this situation where saying, well, how then do we allay healthy workers' concerns? You know, people who might have been interacting with this person, and that's a great question. There are ways to do that without disclosing the person's identity, of course. And one thing that just came up with a client yesterday is they asked, well, do we even have to tell them if it's an employee? You know, we have customers coming into our workplace every day. And I said, no, you don't. You have an obligation to be candid with your workforce about a threat so that they can act accordingly. But you don't have to tell them that it's necessarily an employee or a customer. You can just say that there was a case in the workplace, and then lay out the steps that the employer is taking to protect its staff. Andrew, do you have anything to comment there?
Yeah, I think during when I was discussing that, I certainly, Nick is the legal expert, and I'm providing more of what we're seeing companies do in terms of best practices in terms of employee communications. When it comes to the judgment call about what to tell employees and when, there's no hard and fast rule, other than obviously staying on the right side of the law. And I think it will be a difficult judgment call for a number of companies in terms of when they find it appropriate to tell employees that there has been a confirmed or possible case of coronavirus in the office. The point of my advice was to say that in terms of maintaining employee confidence in its employer and a high degree of understanding about what the company is doing and protecting really the employer brand of that company amongst its employees, we do recommend trying to lean to the side of communicating more than less. Obviously, again, staying within the parameters of what is legally permissible. So if, for example, if there is a situation where, and I think I saw a question about if there's a small office space and, if there's one person who's been sent home, is everyone going to know? And how, if you told everyone, that might cause more panic than not. We have found, and not just in this case, but in similar cases where there's critical information that employers need to communicate to employees, that it is better to get in front of issues and communicate to employees what they need to know versus having them find it out through another source, through whether the office grapevine or somewhere else on the internet in terms of what information they're getting, or on employees' social media channels, which we see more and more, especially amongst large multinational corporations where there's employees in different areas, and they'll have, in many cases, their own chat rooms through unofficial channels. Because once there is misinformation in the workplace, it's much harder to address it and correct it than it is to be the initial source of that information. So it is a judgment call, but we are counseling our clients to err on the side of over-communicating.
Thanks, Andrew. We're getting a lot of questions about employees who can't telework and an employer's obligation vis-a-vis leave if the employee doesn't have leave or if the office is closed, because I know a lot of us whose offices are still open might be planning for potential closures in the coming days or weeks. One question here that really hits on all these points: what if an employee's job responsibility cannot be done working from home and the employee does not have enough leave to use? Does the employer have to pay the employee if the office is closed due to coronavirus? And the short answer is no, if there's no available leave under any laws. It's essentially a temporary layoff situation or a work furlough situation. You want to make absolutely sure that the employee is in fact not working from home. But this also touches upon other ideas that employers should be considering to encourage safe behavior, to discourage that hardworking employee I described who doesn't want to take a hit on their paycheck and is going to slog it out and try to drag themselves into work. And so another idea, and there's some questions about this too, what else can an employer do to encourage safe behavior and to minimize their litigation risks, is in addition to that negative paid time off balance recommendation, some less employers, less clients of mine, but some are essentially offering what are pay advances to employees who don't have any leave, mostly hourly employees who, if the office is closed, and then that pay advance is forgiven if the employee stays retained for, say, a year or 2 years after. It works almost like a retention bonus. That's obviously more of an economic burden on an employer than the paid time off, the negative paid time off balance idea that I mentioned. But some of my clients are considering that as well, again, to just keep workplace morale up and to encourage safe behavior. We have a lot of questions about travel as well. One question is, may we ban employees from traveling to high-risk countries? And it's a good question because you need to remember, employees are private people. They have the right to do whatever they want if it's not in the workplace. But you, as the employer, you are free to tell them that, hey, the following list of countries, the CDC level 3 countries especially, those are discouraged from attending. You have a requirement to disclose to us if you travel to those countries. And if you do, then we're going to, you can require that the employee stay home for 14 days and report whether they're symptomatic. And I anticipate employers are going to get into issues about, employees, whether they're being candid or not. But that's why, and this was on a prior slide, it's important to remind in your communications with employees, these mass emails or other notices that are going out to staff, that there's no threat of retaliation, there's no consequences for being candid. And if that travel, that mandatory quarantine policy for travel to those high-risk countries, that's why it should go hand in hand maybe with a temporary enhanced leave policy so that you're encouraging that candor amongst staff when they disclose where they've been traveling.
Yeah, and one point I want to make and general recommendation is that you're going to come across, I believe, in the workforce some gray areas, or at the very least employees are going to be confused and have questions about where exactly their situation might fall in the policies that the company has set out. For example, I might have not, if my daughter traveled to a level 3 country, or my daughter just recently had dinner with a friend who traveled to a level 3 country, even though she had not actually been there, but she spent a significant amount of time with that individual, even though she's asymptomatic, does that require me to be quarantined for 14 days? And so, especially as the virus spreads, which it almost certainly will, there's going to be more of these gray areas, or in terms of travel restrictions. So we recommend potentially setting up a central email address, or other, if you have an intranet, again, some sort of central repository or outlet for employees to send those kinds of questions, so that they're being appropriately triaged and they're getting the correct answers. My company has actually appointed a coronavirus czar, someone who is overseeing all policy and ultimately making the final judgments on some of those close calls. And so, again, that's something that I might recommend, and certainly if you do take those actions about having a centralized email address or point person, to make sure that that is adequately communicated to the employee base.
I think we're going to take one more before we wrap up, because we want to be respectful of people's time. But it seems a couple people have asked a question similar to this one. It's whether employers should be requiring their employees who travel within the U.S. to self-quarantine for 14 days upon their return, not business-related travel. Anywhere within the U.S., probably not. But this gets to the OSHA risk, the litigation risk, the duty of reasonable care that employers owe to their employees. There's no, a lot of my clients say, well, what's required? And I say, well, there's no black line rule about what constitutes reasonable. I mean, that's the standard, really, under the law to provide a reasonably safe workplace. And, time will tell what that means, what constitutes that. And it's changing every day with the information that we're receiving from the federal government and other sources within the medical community. But right now, as far as we know it, if it's just travel within the U.S., anywhere, a self-quarantine for 14 days is probably not what's required under a reasonable care standard. But maybe if it's to a high infection rate like Seattle, Washington, certainly a cruise ship or any of the CDC level 3 countries travel in those areas, then yes, a self-quarantine is probably a lot closer to satisfying that duty to employees about reasonable care. Andrew, anything else that you want to add? Nope. Well, thank you, everybody. Again, we want to be respectful of time. We apologize for not being able to answer everyone's questions, but Andrew and I are going to go through the questions that were submitted online and follow up people on an individualized basis. And as you see here on our last slide, our contact information and a little more information about our respective practices is here for your review as well. Thank you, everybody, for attending our webinar.